The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which seemed wrong, somehow. Bad news should come on a Monday, when the week already feels like a wait. Not on a Tuesday, when you still have the faint, foolish hope that things might turn out all right. Sylvie Crowe was 22 years old when the executor of her uncle's estate handed her a sealed envelope and would not quite meet her eyes. She was standing in the hallway of the house she had lived in for 11 years. The house her uncle, Reuben Crowe, had brought her to after her parents died of fever outside Medicine Hat, when she was 11 and had nothing but a canvas bag and a habit of watching people's hands when they talked. Reuben had been a quiet man, a widower, a harness maker by trade. He had not been warm in the way that some people are warm, but he had been steady. Steady was a kind of love Sylvie had come to understand. It was the kind that shows up every morning without being asked. The envelope contained a document 3 pages long. The language was legal and dense, the kind designed to make you feel that the plain meaning of words no longer applied. But the plain meaning was this: the house, the shop, the tools, the land, all of it had been mortgaged against a debt Sylvie had not known about. A loan taken from a man named Desmond Farrow, who was described in the document as a business associate and in town as the man who owned the grain elevator, the feed store, and the patience of the local bank in equal measure. The debt had come due. The estate could not satisfy it. Miss Crowe was to vacate the premises within 30 days. 30 days. Sylvie read the number twice, the way you read something that makes no sense the first time and no more sense the second. 30 days, and then she would be standing on the street in Laurel Creek, Manitoba, in the 3rd week of October, with winter already sharpening its teeth on the horizon. The executor, a man named Whitmore, with a thin mustache and a briefcase that looked too new for his face, repeated the word sorry 3 times in the span of 2 minutes. He said it the way people say sorry when they mean I am relieved this is happening to you, and not to me. Sylvie thanked him and closed the door before the 3rd apology was fully out of his mouth. We ask you to hold that image for a moment. A young woman alone in a hallway, holding a piece of paper that has just rearranged her entire world. No parents, no uncle now, no house in 30 days. And outside, the smell of early frost coming in under the door. That evening, Sylvie sat at the workbench in the back of the harness shop and did what Reuben had taught her to do when a problem felt too large to look at directly. She broke it into its parts. She had $41.60 in the tin box in the kitchen, the result of 3 years of mending work and the small wages Reuben had pressed on her, even when she told him not to. She had her clothes, her winter coat, a horse named Keeper, a 9-year-old bay gelding, patient and sound, and a saddle that Reuben had repaired so many times it had become more his work than the original maker's. She had the tools of the shop, or some of them. The executor had indicated that the shop's inventory would be assessed and claimed against the debt. She was not sure what that meant in practice. She decided she would find out. She also had, hanging on a peg above the bench, the thing she valued most and had not yet thought of in terms of money: Reuben's stitching clamp. It was a wooden tool, hand-built, roughly the size of a small sawhorse, with jaws of hardwood lined with leather, designed to hold a piece of harness steady while you stitched it. Reuben had made it himself 40 years ago, before he ever came to Laurel Creek. The wood was darkened with oil and use. The leather jaws were worn smooth in exactly the places where his hands had rested 1,000 mornings. It was not worth anything to Desmond Farrow. It was worth everything to her. On the other side of the ledger, which she wrote on the back of the executor's envelope, because she did not want to waste good paper on bad news, she wrote her liabilities. They were substantial. She was 22, which in a town like Laurel Creek meant she was old enough to be a wife and not yet taken seriously as anything else. She had no family to write to. Reuben's people were all in New Brunswick and had never made the trip west, not even for the funeral. She had skills, good ones, she believed, but the skills of a harness maker were not in high demand from women. She had apprenticed in the shop since she was 14. She could cut and scave leather, set rivets, saddle stitch, with an evenness that Reuben had grudgingly called better than his own by the time she was 18. She could look at a broken piece of tack and see what had failed and why. She knew the difference between good oak-tanned leather and dressed-up rubbish that would split at the worst possible moment. These were real things, hard-earned things. But she could not think of a single person in town who would hire a young woman to make harnesses when there were men who had always done it. She could seek domestic work. There were households in Laurel Creek and the farms outside it that would take a capable young woman to cook and clean and care for children. She would be housed and fed. She would be, effectively, invisible. The thought sat in her chest like a stone. Not because the work was beneath her. No honest work was beneath anyone. Reuben had told her that often enough. But because she had seen what happened to women who disappeared into other people's houses. They aged there, became furniture, and were released back into the world 20 years later, with nothing to show for it but worn hands and the knowledge that someone else's children had grown up. She could try Winnipeg. The city had industries, but the city also had 1,000 women with the same idea and the same $40. She tallied the stage fare, the cost of a room, the time it would take to find work, and the arithmetic came back wrong every time she ran it. She put the pencil down and looked at Reuben's stitching clamp. He had always said that the clamp was smarter than he was. He meant it as a joke about the number of times it had held a piece of work steady while he puzzled over a problem. The clamp was patient. The clamp did not panic. You put the work in the clamp's jaws, and it held on while you figured out the next step. She needed to think the way the clamp held, steady, not letting go. She picked up the pencil again and wrote at the bottom of the page, "What do I have that no one in this town is looking for yet?" She stared at the question for a long time. Then she went into the shop and began to read, in the same methodical way she had been taught to read a piece of failed stitching, looking for where the thread had first gone wrong, tracing back to the root. Reuben had kept a ledger for every customer, not just for accounting but for notes. He wrote down the quirks of each horse, the particular stress points on each farmer's equipment, the way the Halverson family's draft team always worked the left collar, worse than the right, because of how they were harnessed to their stone boat. He wrote down which of the local ranchers was expanding and which was quietly selling off stock. He noted when the CPR crews came through and what they needed and when they would come again. He had been reading the landscape of his trade for 30 years, and he had written all of it down in a series of green ledgers stacked on the shelf above the till. Sylvie read them through that night and most of the next day. What she found was not a single answer but a pattern. The homesteaders coming into the Swan River Valley, 40 miles north, were arriving without adequate equipment for the conditions. The land was wetter than what they knew from Ontario or from the prairie further south. The harnesses they brought with them were not built for the mud and the cold. Reuben had noted it twice in different years. Swan River families, he had written, need stitching and re-rivet work done twice as often. Cheaper leather or wrong weight for the wet. And then 2 entries later, Halverson boy says there's no harness maker between here and the pass. 3 days ride. Sylvie read that last line again. 3 days ride. There was no harness maker within 3 days of the people who needed harness making most. She closed the ledger. She sat very still. The fear she had been holding at arm's length since Tuesday began very slightly to recede. Not because her situation had changed, but because she could see, for the first time, the shape of a door where she had been looking at a wall. She would not go to Winnipeg and become one of 100. She would go to Swan River, where she would be one of none. The next morning, Sylvie walked to the hardware on Main Street and stood at the counter for 15 minutes before the owner, a stout man named Gerald Oak, who smelled permanently of linseed oil, acknowledged her. She asked him what he knew about the homesteader settlements along the Swan River. He gave her the kind of look that meant he was deciding whether to answer her seriously. She waited him out. It was a skill she had developed early. He told her, slowly and with the air of a man being generous, that the Swan River Valley had been taking settlers for about 8 years, mostly from Ontario and some from overseas. There was a small town, Birchford, with a general store, a church, and a livery. No permanent craftsman beyond a blacksmith who also attempted basic carpentry and was, by all accounts, better at one than the other. The nearest established town with trades was Dauphin, 2 days south. She thanked him, asked 2 more specific questions about road conditions and river crossings, noted that he answered the second one more readily than the first, and left. She went home and she packed. We want you to understand what that packing looked like, because it matters. It was not the packing of someone leaving in defeat. It was the packing of someone who has found the next move and is moving. Sylvie sorted the shop with the same cold clarity she had applied to the ledger. She set aside what the executor could have. The inventory of stock leather, the buckles and rings and rivets that were counted in the estate's assets. She left those stacked neatly on the bench with a written inventory, because Reuben had always believed that a clear record was an act of respect, even toward people who did not deserve it. What she took was what she had made herself, or what had been given to her specifically. Her own set of needles, the curved ones for saddle work, rolled in a leather pouch she had stitched at 16 as a practice piece. Her awls, a half dozen, in graduated sizes, her knives, her edge tool, a ball of waxed linen thread, dark brown, enough for a season's work if she was careful, and Reuben's stitching clamp, which she lashed to Keeper's left side with 2 lengths of rope, the way you'd lash a bedroll, because it was too large for a pack and too important to leave behind. Desmond Farrow came by on the 28th day, 2 days before the deadline. He was a tall man with the kind of face that looks like it was designed to express confidence rather than anything so specific. He stood in the doorway of the now nearly empty shop and looked around with the expression of a man calculating what things are worth. He told her, in a tone that managed to be both pleasant and cold, that he was prepared to be flexible. The shop had good bones. He might be willing to let her stay on, he said as a worker, if she wanted to keep the trade going. The arrangement would be simple. She would work the shop. He would receive a portion of the income. The house, he added, with the kind of careful delicacy that is really a form of threat, would be decided later, depending on how things went. Sylvie listened to the whole proposal. She let him finish. Then she said, very quietly, that she appreciated the offer, but had made other arrangements. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the shop. The bare walls, the cleared shelves, the too neat order of an empty space. He had come expecting to negotiate with someone desperate. He found instead someone who had already left. The negotiation he had planned had no one on the other side of it. He said, once, that she was making a mistake. She replied that she would take the risk. He left. She watched him go from the window, and she felt something settle in her, like a stone finding the bottom of a river. Not happiness, not triumph, something quieter than both. The decision, already made, becoming real. She rode out of Laurel Creek on the 30th day, Keeper moving steadily north on the wet clay road, the stitching clamp rocking gently against his side. The sky was low and gray. The aspens along the road had gone gold, and the air smelled of cold mud and coming snow. She had $31 left after buying supplies. She had her tools. She had a horse who trusted her. She had the knowledge that there was no one in Birchford doing what she knew how to do. It took her 4 days, not 3, because the road across the Vermilion River was flooded, and she had to go 6 miles out of her way to find a ford. She arrived in Birchford on a Saturday, which was good, because Saturday was market day, and the small square in front of the general store was busy with wagons and people, and the particular noise of a community trying to accomplish a week's worth of exchange in a single morning. She did not announce herself. She tied Keeper at the rail, unhitched the stitching clamp, and set it up in the open space beside the store's front step. She took out her tools and her leather. She sat down and began to work on a collar that had needed restitching since, before she left Laurel Creek, she had saved it, specifically for this, as a demonstration. The work was small and precise, the kind of thing you can watch comfortably without it feeling like a performance. Within 20 minutes, a man was standing beside her. He had a collar in his hand, cracked along the gullet, the kind of damage that comes from a poor fit rubbing wet leather for too long. "You're a harness maker?" he asked. His name, she would later learn, was Clyde Tupper, a homesteader 3 miles out, and he had not been asking a question so much as testing a fact that seemed improbable. "I am," Sylvie said. She did not look up from her stitching. She had learned from Reuben that you let the work speak first. "Put it on the clamp and let me see it." He did. She looked at the crack, ran her thumb along the stitching line, checked the weight of the leather. She told him what had failed and why, told him what a proper repair would require, and gave him a price. The price was fair, slightly less than Reuben would have charged in Laurel Creek, because she understood that she was not yet known here, and that trust has to be earned one stitch at a time. He left the collar and said he'd be back at noon. By noon, she had 3 more pieces of work waiting. The Birchford winter that year came hard and early, the way Manitoba winters often do when the summer has been too agreeable, as though the land is settling a debt. By November, the temperature had dropped to 30 below, and the snow was deep enough that travel between farms became a matter of planning rather than convenience. Sylvie had by then rented a room above the livery from the owner, a widow named Eunice Pask, who had accepted a month's rent in advance and asked no unnecessary questions, which was exactly the kind of landlady that a young woman in uncertain circumstances requires. The shop, it was not a shop yet, just a corner of Eunice's storage barn that she had cleaned out and organized, was cold in the mornings. She heated it with a small iron stove and got to work while the leather was still warming, because cold leather is stiff and unforgiving and will punish you for rushing it. She had learned to read the temperature by the feel of her awl going in. Some mornings it went in clean. Some mornings it told her to wait. Her days had the particular shape of a person who has taken on too much work and is quietly pleased about it. She was up before light, heating the stove, heating water for coffee, sorting the day's jobs in order of urgency. The farmers with broken traces that their horses needed by morning came first. The mending work, the adjustments, the new pieces built from scratch, those came in the afternoon when her hands were warm and the light through the single window was at its best. In the evenings, she kept her own ledger, the way Reuben had taught her, noting each customer, each repair, each piece of material used and paid for. The ledger was also where she wrote observations, the way Reuben had, because the practice of writing things down had always helped her think. She noted that the homesteaders' equipment problems were even more specific than she had expected. The soil in the valley had a particular clay content that packed differently from prairie soil. The horses were being worked in mud conditions that the farmers from Ontario had not trained them for, and the harness was suffering accordingly. She noted which families were expanding and which were struggling. She noted, in the margins, questions she did not yet know the answers to. One question that kept appearing, in different forms, was about a man named Olin Rask. She had heard the name the first week, spoken with the particular careful neutrality that people use when they mean to say something they have decided not to say. Rask was, as near as she could piece together, the man who had sold many of the homesteaders their initial land parcels, acting as a local agent for a land company based in Winnipeg. He had also, it emerged in fragments over the following weeks, been the one to recommend the feed store where most of the local farmers bought their grain and their livestock supplies. The feed store was owned by his brother-in-law. The prices at the feed store were, by any measure, elevated. The farmers paid them because there was nowhere else close enough, and because Olin Rask had a way of explaining the cost of things that made you feel the problem was on your end. Sylvie noted all of this without comment. She was not from Birchford. She had no standing yet to comment on the workings of a community she had arrived in 60 days ago. But she kept the ledger, the way Reuben had kept his, because she knew that the full picture of a place was something you assembled one observation at a time. By December, she had accumulated enough work to buy her own leather from a supplier in Dauphin, direct, bypassing the feed store's inflated prices for the tax supplies. Rask's brother-in-law also stocked. It saved her nearly a third of her material costs. When Clyde Tupper noticed and asked how she managed it, she told him the name of the supplier and the price she was paying. She told 4 other farmers the same thing over the following 2 weeks, because information that helps people is not something you keep to yourself. It is something you pass on. The winter deepened. She kept working. There was an evening in late January, a Wednesday, which still felt like the wrong day for things to happen. But then things do not consult you about their timing. When Eunice Pask knocked on the barn door and said there was someone to see her, the someone turned out to be a young man named Garrett Finch, 18 or so, thin in the particular way of boys who have grown too fast and eaten too little. He held in his hands the remains of a full set of driving harness, or what had been a full set before something catastrophic had happened to it. 3 of the main traces were snapped, 2 of the tugs had pulled clean off their billets, and the collar looked like it had been dragged through a machine. He had been hauling a load of fence posts, he said, when the sled hit a hidden drop in the snow and lurched. The horses panicked. The harness absorbed every bit of the stress it was never designed for, and then stopped absorbing it. He had no money to pay for the repair, he said. His face made it clear that admitting this had cost him something. His family's horses were their livelihood, and without the harness, both animals were effectively useless through the rest of the winter. He had asked at the feed store about replacement parts. The prices quoted were more than his family earned in a month. Sylvie looked at the harness. It was not good leather to start with. The thin, poorly tanned kind that she had learned to recognize by the way it flexed in her hands, stiff in the wrong places, and soft in the wrong places. But the metalwork was solid, and the structural pieces were repairable if she used her own stock leather for the traces. She told him to leave it. She told him to come back in 3 days. She told him to bring, if he had it, whatever his family could spare. She named 4 or 5 things, practical things: a jar of rendered lard, a half-cord of good dry birch, a brace of rabbits if the trapping had been good. Not because these things were equal in value to the work, but because Reuben had taught her that people who cannot pay in money can still pay in dignity if you let them, and that letting them is a form of respect. Garrett Finch stood in the barn doorway for a moment, as if he was recalibrating something in his understanding of how things worked. Then he said, "Yes, ma'am, in a voice that was still deciding whether it was going to crack, and left. We will tell you plainly that the 3 days she spent rebuilding that harness were among the most satisfying of her working life to that point. Not because it was difficult, or because the result was spectacular, though it was both, but because she could feel with every stitch what the work was for. It was not an abstraction. It was horses that would be back in harness by February, and a family that would make it through. When Garrett came back, he brought a friend who brought a question. His uncle's neck yoke had split, and could she look at it? She looked at it. She said yes. This was how it worked. This is how it always works. In places where there is real need and someone who knows how to meet it. By March, the community had arrived at a consensus about Sylvie Crowe that no one had formally proposed, but everyone had privately reached. She was the person you called when the equipment had failed, and the spring planting was 3 weeks away, and you could not afford to be down a team. She was not the cheapest option. She was not cheap at all, because good work is not cheap. But she was the person whose repairs held, whose word you could count on, and who would tell you plainly if the piece was beyond saving and what you should replace it with, instead of wasting money on a repair that wouldn't last. She had not set out to become indispensable. She had set out to survive. Indispensable was what happened when survival turned out to require being genuinely useful. It was the blacksmith, a large, quiet man named Emmett Core, who first told her what Olin Rask had been saying about her. Emmett Core was the kind of man who did not repeat things unless he thought you needed to hear them. So when he set down the bit he was working on and said, without preamble, that Rask had been talking to some of the families on the south side, she understood it was important. Rask was saying, Emmett reported in a flat and careful voice that Sylvie's leather came from inferior stock, bought cut rate from a Dauphin supplier who dealt in seconds. He was saying that the repairs she'd done on some of the heavier equipment were not built to handle spring mud conditions, that there had been failures. He did not specify which ones, to which people, or with what evidence. He was saying, in the way that men like him say things, that a girl who had apprenticed under a small-town operator in Laurel Creek was not the right person to trust with equipment a family's livelihood depended on. Sylvie listened to all of this. She asked Emmett if there were specific pieces of her work that had failed. He said not that he knew of. She asked if Rask had named any. He said no. She thanked Emmett. She went back to her bench. She understood what was happening. The feed store had been her customer's primary source for tax supplies before she arrived. Her arrangement with the Dauphin supplier, and the information she had passed along to a dozen families, had cut into that business meaningfully. Rask was doing what Desmond Farrow had done in Laurel Creek, which was to take someone he had not taken seriously and discover, too late, that she had built something he could not simply acquire. She did not argue with him publicly. She did not seek him out. What she did was write a letter to the land agent's office in Winnipeg that administered the area's homestead titles. A letter that asked a series of specific, politely worded questions about the standard commission rates for land parcel agents in the Swan River Valley, and whether those rates were consistent with what local settlers had been charged. She had heard, over the winter, enough fragments to know that the rates Rask had collected on several of the land sales were above the published standard. She did not know if this was fraud or merely an aggressive reading of what the market would bear. But the letter asked the question. She also, in the same week, spoke to Clyde Tupper and to Garrett Finch's father and to Eunice Pask, and to 3 other people she had come to know as solid and fair-minded over the winter. She told them what Rask had been saying. She did not editorialize. She reported it the way you would report a weather observation. Here is the information. Here is its source. You may do what you like with it. Then she went back to work. Spring came in a rush that year, the way it sometimes does in Manitoba, the snow going from permanent fact to memory in what felt like a week. The mud season that followed was the worst the valley had seen in several years. The kind of mud that grabs a wagon wheel to the axle and charges rent. Sylvie was busier than she had ever been. Every farm in the valley was working to get ready for planting, and every farm's equipment had spent the winter collecting the damage that would only become obvious when you put it back under load. She had hired a helper by April, a 14-year-old girl named Bea Drummond, whose mother had asked on her behalf, and who turned out to have an excellent eye and hands that learned quickly. Sylvie paid her fairly, the way Reuben had paid her, and did not explain what she was doing so in deliberate contrast to how other people managed. She simply did it because it was correct. The letter to Winnipeg received a reply in mid-April. It came from a senior clerk in the land agent's office. and it was formally worded and cautious in the way of government correspondence. But the substance was clear. The commission rates Rask had collected on 14 of the documented transactions in the Birchford area were between 15 and 30% above the published standard. The office had initiated a formal review. It thanked Miss Crowe for bringing the discrepancy to their attention. She showed the letter to Clyde Tupper, who showed it to the 3 families who had paid the highest commissions. Those families, separately and without apparent coordination, each sent their own letters to Winnipeg. Olin Rask left Birchford in June, before the review concluded, taking his brother-in-law's feed store inventory with him. The feed store building stood empty for 2 months and was eventually taken over by a cooperative formed by 7 of the local families to buy supplies direct. They asked Sylvie to keep the accounts, which she did, in a green ledger that looked very like the ones Reuben had kept. She did not celebrate any of this. Justice is quieter than people expect, she found. It is less like a gate swinging open, and more like a pressure releasing, something you had been braced against, slowly letting you stand up straight. By the time the second winter came, Sylvie had moved from the livery corner into a proper shop, a small clapboard building at the edge of the main street that the town council had quietly made available. After the feed store vacancy changed the geography of Birchford's commercial landscape, she had a wood stove, a proper workbench, a window that faced east so the morning light came in when the work was best. She had Bea Drummond 3 days a week. She had a name in the valley that was worth something, which is the only kind of name worth having. On the first day in the new shop, before she brought in any of her tools or stock, she hung Reuben's stitching clamp on the wall beside the door. Not because she needed it there. She used it daily and it would move to the bench. But for that first morning, she wanted to see it in the light of the new space. She stood in the cold, empty room and looked at it for a long time. He had taught her that the work holds what you put into it. He had meant it about leather and thread. But she had come to understand it about other things as well. About knowledge, about fairness, about what you pass on to people who are learning. She was 23 years old. She had no family to write to with news of what she had made. But she stood in her own shop, in a town that had not existed in her life 14 months ago, with her tools and her name, and the quiet evidence of a winter's worth of work that had held under pressure. And she understood something that she thought might take the rest of her life to fully understand, that the people who try to make themselves necessary by controlling what others need will always, eventually be outrun by the people who make themselves necessary by genuinely meeting it. She had not been given a second chance. She had built one, out of the same materials she had always had, in a place that had been waiting, without knowing it, for exactly what she knew how to do. So we'll leave you with a question, because this is the kind of story that asks one. If you had to start over tomorrow, not a new chapter, but genuinely new place, new town, new everything, what would you carry with you? What's the one thing, the tool or the skill or the knowledge, that would be the foundation of everything else you built? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone.